Okay, so I'm going to try to do better on timing and getting through this study. Instead of holding you guys hostage, we've been holding the context hostage. But we will be finishing up Genesis 19 and going into chapter 20 this evening. We got to the portion of the context around verse 10 and 11 where Lot is trying to hold off the attackers. I mean, these are some evil, wicked men. I mean, there's just really no good way of portraying it. And the angels that are there, that Lot had put up, they are protecting Lot, and they've blinded the attackers. And so now, starting at verse 12 and 13, we see a warning given. The two men said to Lot, "Whom else have you here? A son-in-law, and your sons and your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place, because their outcry has become so great before the Lord that the Lord has sent us to destroy it." And so, you know, they're basically kind of scoping the place out. And the actions of what just happened is basically said, okay, it's really bad. It's not just bad, but it's really bad. And it's so bad that this place is going to have to be wiped off the face of the earth. Unfortunately, there's a pretty poor response from the son-in-law, as you see in verse 14. Lot went out and spoke to his son-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, and said, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city." But he appeared to his sons-in-law to be jesting. And so they didn't take it seriously. And you know what? This isn't the first time that this type of response has happened. I personally think back to the time of Noah and the flood. There's no doubt in my mind that he had went out and warned people. Now, I'm not saying that he spoke to every individual on the face of the earth, but he had warned the folks, and I'm persuaded, I'm of the opinion and belief, they didn't take it seriously. Had they, I think there'd been more than just his family. You know, unfortunately, it's getting to the point now where even families not even taking family seriously. And it's still happening today, isn't it? I think if we're honest with ourselves, I think we can, and we all have, family members who are not faithful as they should be. I mean, I think we've all experienced that before. And so I think it's important to note this idea of where mocking the warning of God, mocking the upcoming judgment of God, and how this is extremely problematic because it shows a overall disposition of God's not serious. My God would never do that. Now, obviously, that's not how they're arguing, but a form of mockery. You ever heard of people saying, well, that's not my Jesus? It's a form of mockery. They're mocking the righteousness and justness and holiness of God. When they say, well, no, God won't destroy sinners. He won't condemn sinners. He won't do that. Abraham's just had a discourse with him where he's, well, God, wait a minute. Surely you're not going to, if you can find 50 people, 50 righteous people, you're not going to condemn them all with all of those wicked people, are you? And we talked about the numbers. It went from 50 to 45 to 40, 35, 30, all the way down to 10. God's serious. He is serious about sin. And not only that, but in the warning, and I'm going to try not to read every verse, so we're going to kind of paraphrase over this. But they were warned not to do what? When the angels told them, hey, you need to get up, go. Don't look back. Right? Don't look back. That also is a form of mockery, I believe. I'm convinced of. It's a form of looking back and perhaps longing for what we had previously. Exactly what in Sodom and Gomorrah was worth keeping. The wickedness, the outcry of the wickedness had risen up all the way to God. And he says, okay, I've had enough of this. As parents, have you ever said that with your children? I've just had enough of this. We've all said it. And we've all banished them to their rooms. Probably beaten them to a pulp. I say that tongue in cheek. Obviously, we're not promoting or endorsing the idea of beating children, but we spank them, we take toys away, we ground them, all that stuff, because we've had enough. God's had enough, and with this sin problem, the idea is that He's essentially given them over to their lust. And He's said, okay, this is the consequence. And so, again, they were warned not to look back. And Lot, he fears escaping to the direction of the mountains, and so he requests to go somewhere else, to Zoar. And so God grants him the request, and then around verse 24 is when the fire and brimstone begins to fall from the heaven, and everything's just totally destroyed. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and He overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew out from the ground. And then look at verse 26. But his wife from behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. I think this longing for the continued lifestyle, this is nothing new. And so when we see what we see today, what we witness, what we hear, how we hear people talk, what we observe, it shouldn't shock us. Because we have that reminder, I think it's in Luke 17, where Jesus says, remember Lot's wife. Most of the time, folks want to focus on just the positive nature of things. Like David is often viewed as a man after God's own heart, because that's exactly right. He is viewed as a man after God's own heart, but how often do people want to talk about the sin with Bathsheba? And the endorsement of the murder, well, not just the endorsement, the setup of his best friend's murder. We don't want to talk about that. But that's a big part of David's life, actually. So, I mean, you get not only the good of David, but you also get the negative aspect of it. And what it shows is the heart of the man. What kind of men and women are we going to be? Are we going to be men and women of faith, people after God's own heart, likened to David, where, okay, when we make a mistake, we don't allow that mistake to define us. He didn't allow that to define him because he had to face consequence, right? What was one of the consequences? Anybody remember? After David had conceived with Bathsheba, and God said, what's going to happen to that baby? It's going to die. Oh, that's not fair, that's mean, that's unjust, that's cruel and unusual punishment. What do you think we're doing with God when we sin against Him? We as the creation are sinning against our Creator. That's cruel and unusual. Who are we as the clay to look up to the potter and say, shake our fist, right? We get things backwards way too often. And we have this superiority complex because we are intelligent beings, because we're made in the image of God. Mark, were you going to? Right.
that have choices.
Right.
And we're the only ones that don't carry out our mission.
Right. We deviate from it. And I think that's because of desire. That choice. And so what are we longing for in our life? Is it to fulfill the fleshly desire of our bodies and our, whatever it is to build up wealth and fame and fortune or whatever it is? And, you look at, remember Lot's wife, and so I think she was reflecting on herself in that I'm losing everything I had. And that's what defined her, was her past. And so for us, are we continuously turning ourselves into pillars of salt because we're allowing our past to continue to define us? Or are we pressing on and moving forward to the heavenly goal? You see. Now, I'm not saying Zoar is heaven, but they're coming out of destruction, from the place of destruction, the place of sin, and they're going to a place of, you could almost view it as a place of refuge, because that's where safeness is. That's where safety is. Because if they stay in Sodom and Gomorrah, what happens to them? They're going to die. So God is giving them an opportunity to, one, trust in Him. Right? If you don't trust in God, perhaps she didn't trust in God. I mean, we're not given specific verbiage or told exactly why she turned around. But what is it that we know? But his wife from behind him looked back. That's what we know. Was it a lack of belief? Was it a lack of trust? It was certainly a lack of obedience. I think the best way to describe it was a lack of faith on her part. And when there's a lack of faith, I want us to think back to James. If there's a lack of faith, can that faith save? If we're justified by faith and there's a lack of faith, then can that faith save? I don't think so. Now, I'm not the gatekeeper. I'm not the guardian of heaven. But I'm just trying to put pieces together to try to make sense of all of this. Did the sons-in-law make it?
No.
Because there was a lack of faith. Lot's wife didn't make it because there was a lack of faith. And so, verse 27 through 29, Abraham, he sees all of this destruction. You look at verse 28, he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land ascended like the smoke of a furnace. This is not a pleasant thing to look at. And so thus it came about when God destroyed the cities of the valley that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, and when he had overthrown the cities in which Lot had lived. And then kind of the rest of the story is the story about how the two daughters kind of concoct this not so bright plan, but they do it anyways. They essentially get Lot drunk and they lay with him in order to produce more children. So they become pregnant, and Moab is born, and he's the ancestor of the Moabites, obviously. And then Ben-ammi is born, and he's the ancestor of the Ammonites, and those are future enemies of Israel, is what's being created here, essentially. Anybody have anything in chapter 19 before we go into chapter 20?
I'd just like to comment on that pillar of salt, which you turn to a pillar of salt. Mm-hmm. And you're missing a faith, but also I think the most powerful thing was obedience.
Yeah.
Because she was told not to look back.
Yeah.
And she still looked back. And so when God speaks, He intends for us to carry out every bit of His word that we're going to be seeing here, as we saw last week, or whenever it was we were talking about Abraham.
Oh, yeah, we're working on it.
But faith, that obedience is a evidence of our faith.
Yes, it's proof of it.
Yeah.
But, but it's not something that, I think sometimes what people have done is they've tried to create a disconnect from faith and obedience, but you can't have faith without obedience. It's intertwined together. Faith is belief, faith is trust, faith is obedience. It's all of those things. And so absolutely, if God says something, then we need to follow through. He said, don't look back. Don't look back. And then again, and I believe we have New Testament example, and I referenced it a moment ago. I think it's Philippians 3, where Paul essentially says that he presses on. Yeah, Philippians 3 verse 12, he says, not that I have already obtained it or have already become perfect, but I press on so that I may lay hold of that for which also I was laid hold of by Christ. And so the point that I think that Paul's making is that, he can't look back in his previous life and change a thing. It's not going to help him for that day. It's not going to help him for his future. Whatever stands before him, because when he writes the letter to the Philippians, does anybody know where he's at? He's in prison. Can you imagine being stuck in prison and you're saying, I'm going to press forward. I'm going to press on. Where? So this is clearly not a physical pressing forward. This is spiritual. This is mental. It's psychological in your mind. It's mental. Not saying that we're supposed to be mental and crazy, but it's a mentality pressing forward in our faith, in our relationship with God, because it's relational. How successful are relationships that are a one-way street? It might last a little bit. Well, what's the chances of it actually lasting? One-way relationships don't work. The few marriages that I've tried to help and kind of straighten up, that's one of the things I tell them. You've got to get on the same page, and you have to be working together for each other. But if you're only working selflessly for self, that's just a one-way street. That's not two working together. That's you working for your end. And it's just, again, it might last for a little bit, but eventually, to me, that's on sinking sand. It's on a shaky, weak foundation. Okay, so Genesis 20. Let's start.
Can I say something too?
Yes.
When you talk about why she looked back faith, she didn't trust in God. You think she was missing Sodom and Gomorrah?
That they probably could have had friends. She could have had,
Missing something?
perhaps. That's where they had established their life.
People miss sin. They don't really give up sin.
Yeah.
Give up everything or want to give up everything.
And because, so I'm not playing devil's advocate, but I want you to think, I want to challenge you. We do a good job of portraying, I've given up sin, but really deep down we give up everything but really one thing. And we've got to hold on to that one thing, right? Well, was her looking back that one thing? I think so. There was something there. I'm not saying she was out fornicating against Lot or anything. I don't know. And so, have to be careful in not attributing motive. But here's what we do know. God said, don't look back. And so you best not look back. And if you do, you know, I think that leads to the idea that she didn't fully trust God. And if you don't trust God, it doesn't matter what you do. You can go through all the steps of leaving. Yeah, but she was leaving. Just because she looked back doesn't mean she wasn't obeying. And that's why I've said before, partial obedience is still disobedience. Well, she was still leaving. He didn't have to do that to her. That's not the point. It's like you're missing the whole point. And what we do is we try to rationalize our sin and say, well, see, it wasn't really that big of a deal. She didn't deserve to die.
Could it also be that it does say his wife and 2 daughters? She was looking back because she was leaving children behind that we possibly don't even. Because it does. I mean, it just says 2.
Well, the daughters were there with them.
But I'm just saying.
Well, she's leaving something behind.
Some sons, they could have left some other daughters.
Well,
It just says 2.
they left the son-in-laws behind.
Because it just says 2. So maybe there was more children.
There could have been, possibly.
But I mean, just don't know.
Bill? Oh. Sorry, I saw his hand first.
I think Lot's wife pulled an Eve.
Oh,
Just like Eve disobeyed. Except Lot's wife's punishment was more severe than Eve's punishment.
well,
I mean, I want to know how many of us, if we're leaving a city and God's going to destroy the city and it's going to be burning fire, aren't going to want to turn around and look at the spectacle, you know. How is it burning, you know? What is it
look at the fireworks going on.
It's just a little, I'm just going to turn around and look. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I'm not hurting anybody.
Yeah. But
It's a little sin, but
Yeah, well, you are technically, and on a spiritual realm, you are, because God Almighty has spoken.
well,
that's right.
And he who puts his hand to the plow and look back, it teaches us.
is not fit for the kingdom.
Now that's simple, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, I want to see my rover screen. No, you.
Well, God says to obey the laws of the land, and how many of us go over 75 when they're going up the
Quit
little
talking
road?
about me.
That's just a little thing. That's just 1 mile over, 2 miles over.
Yeah.
That bothers me.
That's actually why I think, you know, like think about 1 John 1, and it's laying out the principles. He who says he has no sin is a liar and deceives himself, right? And the truth's not in him. So like think about that. Like we sin a lot more often than we care to admit.
And that's a deliberate sin where you're going over the speed limit.
Sure. Absolutely.
That's not usually accidental. Hey, I'm in there too, Mark.
But if your tires are wore, you're not going over the speed limit. 1 mile over.
Yeah. See, I tell people stop signs aren't suggestions because I can't tell you how many accidents I've worked at an intersection. But, you know, again, I don't think we really grasp how often we sin. Now, I'm not saying, and this is where we've got to be careful, because I've experienced the extremes, and I think we have to be careful with the extremes. It's kind of like storytelling. You know, well, Eva has her side of the story and Bill has his side of the story. And unfortunately for both of them, the truth's probably somewhere in the middle, right? And so, you know, it's the same thing with the extremes on teaching. You know, you've got some people that say, well, we're just so sinful, and they teach this sin, flesh nature, and they say that we just can't do right. And it's like, wait a minute. It's like, what's the point of the gospel? Titus 2 says, for the grace of God has appeared to all men, bringing salvation to all men. And it says, instructing us to deny ungodliness. So how can you teach one thing saying that you can't do right, but then on the flip side, you teach self-reliance? So we have to be somewhere in the middle where we are relying and trusting in God. And I think in this case, unfortunately for Lot's wife, I don't think she trusted in God enough. So she looked back for whatever reason it was. And to Bill's point, yeah, I mean, we look at the punishment and we say that it's far more severe than what happened with Eve. And so, like, we throw out that question, why does God work one way in some instances and other ways in other instances? Ultimately, all of it, whether it's judgment that's passed or it's divine blessing that's passed, it's all to accomplish His purpose. And so He didn't choose to strike Adam and Eve dead. He has to make examples out of them. I think that's the point with Adam and Eve. But their sin brought forth spiritual death. You see, I think we'd all agree with that. And I think that's what Romans 5 teaches, is that the death that it brought is spiritual death. Yes, it also brought about physical death, I agree. But it brings forth spiritual death. Sin is transgression of God's law, for the wages of sin is death. I don't think that's physical death. I think that's spiritual death. I saw another hand. Was it Vergerine?
Maybe she had nothing to do. I don't think so, because the son-in-laws were born, so there were no other children that found the injury. I don't think they had them.
Yeah,
That they would be children would have been born also.
I think so. But I mean, there was something that she looked back for. As to what it was,
Can we just not say that curiosity killed the cat and Lot's wife?
yeah, I think that's a really good point. Except it didn't kill a cat, it killed her. You know?
It's a really beautiful thing, though, when we look at the nature of God, and that's what we are contrasting here, that Old Testament, how God moved and acted among the people back then to Christ coming to be a perpetuation. So now that we have an avenue of escape, because we have an opportunity to repent. And so
Absolutely.
that's why it's so important to have a good background in the Old Testament to see how God really acted.
Right.
And the grace of God to come down in the flesh and be an example for us.
Right. Absolutely. And so here in chapter 20, I have 10 points I'd like to make. This is not a 10-point sermon, but just 10 points that I think if we all behave, we can make these points out. Okay, and that includes me. So first and foremost, number one, His promises and His purposes are not dependent on our perfection. Because, wouldn't you agree, has everybody read Genesis 20? Okay, everybody's read Genesis 20, right? So we know the story. He lies again, right? He puts Abimelech in the same predicament as Pharaoh, right? From Genesis 12. Well, it's a half lie, half truth. So it's still a lie. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And so, I mean, we think about it, he morally and spiritually he fails. Because he still lied. He repeats the old sin of Genesis 12, and to me, he's acting out of fear. Wouldn't you say he acted out of fear? Because he says, hey, in order to keep me alive, tell them that you're my sister. Well, that's out of fear. And God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, has He? What kind of spirit has He given us?
Sound and love and sound mind.
Yeah, right? So, when you act out of fear and your faith is driven out of fear, compromise is really easy to creep in to our lives. And compromises, to me, is one of the most dangerous things when we begin compromising here, compromising there, because we begin opening doors that really have no business being opened. Right? And so, God is intervening still here in chapter 20 in order to protect Sarah and the promised seed, which is Isaac, right? I think what we need to take from this is that God's work doesn't advance because we are flawless. that's not why his purpose continues. It's because he's faithful. So there's two guards. Well, there's guards against two errors here. Number one error is despair when you see faithful people fail. And so, like, well, what do you mean, preacher? So, how often have we seen people leave and they'll say, well, there's hypocrites in the church. So what are they pointing out? They're pointing out the failures of those in the church. Well, Abraham failed too. Yet God promised him. He made a universal promise. But his failure didn't stop God's faithfulness. And so I think we need to understand that our failures don't stop God's faithfulness in our salvation. Now, if we continue to be failures and we continue in failing, it's not that He can't save us, but we're not accessing the atoning blood of Christ, you see. But one failure is not a defining moment, an isolated failure, right? Kind of like what I was talking about on Sunday morning about men and us looking at men and trying to qualify them. Sometimes people, they're looking for those isolated failures and say, well, see, he's not qualified. And so you're going to take 5 or 6 moments of his life and you're going to establish a basis and put him in a cage and say, well, he can never be qualified because of those 5 or 6 failures. When I think in reality, he's probably failed a whole lot more than the 5 or 6 times that you know about. And how many times have you failed also? So there's that to consider. But secondly, excusing sin because God's going to fix it anyways. And I think we have to be careful of that. I don't think Abraham's sin's excused because Abimelech calls him to the carpet. Does he not? He says, what's going on here? So, Mark, did you have something?
No, just what you just said there, the qualification for an example, it never say, let him be perfect.
Yeah.
It don't say that. It gives the qualification of things that we're capable of doing and making a decision and carry out.
Yeah. So, number 2, this is going to me and Bill's a little back and forth, right? The half-truth, okay? Fear produces half-truths. Because if he wasn't fearful for his life, he would have just said, well, she's my wife. But he feared for his life in front of Pharaoh. Now, I will say, I think I could probably make a good argument that Abimelech was a more godly man than Pharaoh. Now, that aside, I'll leave that alone. But I think Abimelech's probably more than likely a more God-fearing man, because when God appears to Abimelech, Abimelech's kind of going back and forth with him like, I didn't do anything. So, but fear produces half-truths that become full-on lies. So Abraham, he tells technically a truth. She is his sister, right? Verse 12 in chapter 20. Besides, she actually is my sister, the daughter of my father, but she's not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. But he's allowing fear to guide this because, well, Abimelech's going to do the same thing as Pharaoh, right? Well, he doesn't know that. But integrity, right? What's integrity? You don't have to give an exact definition, but I want to know, do you guys kind of understand what integrity is?
Well, integrity is what comes out of your mouth and the actions behind it, basically. Do you deliver upon who you say you are?
Okay. And Sarah?
I was just going to say it's doing the right thing when nobody's looking.
And I think I heard that said over here too. But doing the right thing when no one's looking. Right? Being truthful. And so I think obviously with Pharaoh, he was kind of the same way, like, dude, you lied. You brought all these plagues on us. And well, he does the same thing with Abimelech. Go to verse 18. For the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the household of Abimelech because of Sarah. Well, Sarah didn't do anything, but it's the lie that Abraham told. And then, Abimelech had brought her into his house to be one of basically his maids, essentially. So because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And so for even Abimelech, there's a trust thing going on. I don't know if I can trust you. And so I think it's important for us to be careful not to try to rationalize moments of dishonesty as where, I'm protecting myself. Well, from what? I'm protecting my image, because image is everything, right? But if someone only knows half the story, you can't control what they think about you, right? Excuse me, Bill.
Well, in verse 3, God came to Abimelech in a dream and called him a dead man.
Right.
That gets your attention.
Absolutely.
Get mine.
Yeah, well, the story of Nebuchadnezzar, and he's seeing the handwriting on the wall. That'll get your attention too. There's a ghost drawing on my wall. Something's not right. So yeah, that's exactly right. God comes to Abimelech and he says, you're a dead man because of the woman whom you've taken in. She's married. I think.
Thank God for his providence. If he hadn't interfered, what would have happened?
Well, and that's just it. He's going to continue. His purpose is going to press on. His purpose is going to go forward regardless of the faithfulness of man. Abraham's acting out of fear instead of out of faith. But God's, and I think God understands that. And so he says, okay, let me go to Abimelech so we can straighten this out. You see. So, number 3, I'm trying to get through the, boy, I need, whew. Number 3, being the servant of God does not remove accountability from us. And so look at verse 9 and 10. Verse 9 and 10, Abimelech called Abraham and said, what have you done to us? Not what God has done, but what have you done? Because who was it that closed up all the wombs? Well, God did it. He did it on account of Sarah, because if Abimelech lays with her and she gets pregnant, what happens to the promise? It would be none effect. Now that's obviously a big if, and that's not what happened, so we don't have to go down that road, but that's a thought. What have you done to us, and how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. What have you encountered that you have done this thing? And so, I think this is God working through a pagan king. God does not always use people that we think He uses to get our attention. And I think that's something that we've lost, that's gotten lost from us. Sometimes He uses others, those that we would never even dream of using. And so God uses unexpected people, even, I believe, unbelievers, to confront us in our faith.
I think so. I can say something about the woman at the well.
Sure.
Nobody really had anything to do with her because of her life. And God chose her. But deep down in her mind, she said she believed in God. Because she said when the Messiah called Jesus, yeah, tell her so. She kind of believed.
Right. Well, when He said what He said to her, she went and told everybody.
Yeah, so
And so, so kind of getting back to getting our attention, the only way it's going to get our attention if we have a sense of humility about us. Because if we just go through it, God's not working through them, He's not using them, He only uses people like me. See, that's pride. See? And so I think we have to be careful that we're not allowing our spiritual position. Well, I've been in the church for 50 years. Now, I'm not saying you guys are saying it, but I've heard it said. Okay? And so you don't even have to say it. If you think it, I think you're in dangerous territory. Well, I've been doing this for such a long time. I know what I'm doing. And what you hear is you hear a bunch of I's and me's instead of trust and reliance on God through that. And so again, our position in the church, whatever role it's in, whether it's an evangelist, elder, deacon, whatever, that doesn't guarantee a spiritual maturity in every moment of our lives. And so again, it's a sobering thought. It's you're going to get humble pie every once in a while. Now, what are you going to do with it? So, number 4, God's going to hold everyone accountable to moral standards. Now, again, we have no evidence that Abimelech is necessarily a man who has a covenant with God. Okay, we don't have evidence. We could suggest it, and I was making the suggestion earlier that I perhaps think that he was more godly than Pharaoh, but that doesn't mean that I'm arguing that he was necessarily a godly man. And so, but here's the thing. I don't believe he was a covenant man with God, and yet God goes to him directly and warns him that, hey, you are just as responsible. Because what did God tell him in verse 3? He says, behold, you are a dead man. Even though he really didn't know the full truth. So was he responsible or not? Absolutely. He was accountable to it. And so here's my point. I'm not trying to get super doctrinal with you, but these are some things that you can work on in your own homework. I have heard it said in some doctrinal teachings, well, we can't teach that because, those people are not believers. And so that standard, so God's standard on marriage, is not the standard for the world because they're not Christians. And I've heard it said. I've heard men who claim to be Bible scholars, gospel preachers, some from preaching schools, say that the teachings of the gospel, as far as regarding marriage, divorce, and remarriage, that doesn't apply to everybody. That only applies to Christians. And it's like, you better prove that, because when you're looking at that, that's a standard of morality. Right is right, wrong is wrong, period. And if we're going to start weighing on the balance, saying, well, this doctrine only applies to Christians, it doesn't apply to unbelievers, well, then you're going to have to go through the whole thing and say, you know what, the moral standard doesn't apply to anybody because they weren't believers. Logan?
I kind of wondered that about, when it comes to laws, how would that work? Because laws have to be based on morality, but I guess everyone have a different morality, so not everyone is a Christian, so on one hand, you can't force everyone to abide by laws that only count the Bible, but at the same time, if we're to say we can't use the Bible, then we can't. What code of morality do you use? So I kind of wondered that with law, how would you enforce law?
Well, that's just it. So enforcement of law is different than accountability to law. So first and foremost, I don't care how much law you try to legislate, you can't legislate morality. It's impossible. Law is still going to be broken irregardless. People are going to choose what to do, what they want to do, how they want to do it, each and every day of their lives. They're going to have to make the decision within their own selves that this is what's right. So the enforcement of the law is not the same of understanding where the law came from. But again, I look at this example here with Abimelech and Abraham, and God's clearly holding Abimelech and his family, not for ransom, but He's holding them accountable because He shut up all the wombs of all the women there. And He's told Abimelech, you are a dead man. Now, either God said it and meant it, or He's just blowing smoke. Now, is anybody comfortable enough to say He's blowing smoke? I'm not. So, the morality law of God is universal, and it's not limited to just believers. That's my point. His standard of morality affects all. So just because someone's an unbeliever doesn't give them the right to go out and murder. Right? It's wrong. And so that's just one example. And so ignorance of the law is what? Ignorance of the law is no excuse, isn't it? Because God, at one point, He used to wink at ignorance, but now He commands all men everywhere to repent. So, I think that this is reinforced, that ignorance and culture, good intentions, they don't remove accountability. That's what people say to make themselves feel better. But just because you feel better about something because you've come up in your mind of how you can get away with this, well, that doesn't, to me, that doesn't pass a sniff test. Okay, so let's quickly, number 5, God protects His purposes even in hostile and secular environments, right? Because what did He do with Sodom and Gomorrah? He destroyed them. So He's not going to allow things like that to thwart His plan. But, you know, Abraham's in a foreign land, is he not? He's not where he's not at home. He's in a foreign land, and so even in that, he's restraining sin because Sarah is his wife. And so God's going to preserve this line, this lineage, that you are going to have a baby and a child with your wife Sarah. And so basically, here's my point. God's jurisdiction doesn't stay just here in these 4 walls. His jurisdiction goes outside these 4 walls. His jurisdiction is everywhere. Number 6, prayer can restore what sin has damaged. And so you see that in verse 7. Now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet. So this is what God's saying to Abimelech. And he, being Abraham, he will pray for you and you will live. Because what did God say? You're a dead man. So He'll pray for you and you'll live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, and you and all who are yours. And so also verse 17, what ends up happening? Abraham prays for him, right? Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maid so that they all bore children. And so again, failure doesn't mean that prayer's out of the conversation. Failure means that we need to pray, and we ought to pray. And so restoration includes acknowledging sin, acknowledging our problems and our faults. Correction brings about the knowledge of, well, the actual doing, the obeying of God's instruction, and allowing God to work through you and in you. We're not just mindless drones, are we? I hope not. Okay, let me read 7, 8, and 9 real quick. So number 7, God's mercy is evident even in judgment. Why? Because He took out Lot and his family. He would have saved Lot's wife had she obeyed, but His mercy still covered Lot and his family. But His mercy extends to Abimelech and his household, because he could have killed him for what he was doing. God's name is at stake in the conduct of His people. Go back to Abimelech's question to Abraham. What is this that you have done? And Abraham could have said, hey, I'm a godly man. And so Abimelech turns around and says, well, what kind of God are you serving? Right? So our actions, our thoughts, the things that we do can reflect poorly on God, can it not? If we claim to be believers, if we claim to be Christian, and yet we're going out and doing ungodly things to unbelievers, what does that show them? It reflects poorly, doesn't it? Number 9, past faithfulness does not guarantee present obedience. So just because you were faithful at one time doesn't mean that's going to carry you through the rest of your life. Your faith must be ongoing. Number 10, God's grace should lead us to more trust not complacency, where we just, well, God's got me, so I don't have to do anything. Abraham's needing rescued again. And so, but the repeated nature of this sin, or any sin, to me can show that we have a dangerous understanding of relying on grace where we say, well, I don't have to grow. God's grace has me covered. I understand that we need to rely on His grace because it is by His grace that we are saved, but not while we continue in sin so that grace may abound. May it never be. So I'm sorry, I really wanted to get through those points. Take your psalm books and turn to number 111. We always need to offer up an opportunity, if I'm honest with you, sometimes, have you ever thought about when people come up and they say, hey, how you doing? And we always have that natural response is, oh, good, oh, good. Even though we've had a terrible day, we'll just say, oh, we're doing good. I think sometimes it'd probably benefit us to be a little more honest, where we say, you know what, today's been really challenging. Today's been hectic, it's been heavy, it's been hard. Today's been a hard day. It wasn't easy. I'm not saying this to put myself on a pedestal. I'm telling you about my day. It's not easy to stand before a crowd of people doing something that's completely unnatural. Parents having to bury their children. That'll put a lump in your throat. And I wasn't the one suffering through it. But I have to be there for them and to support them and encourage them. And so sometimes even those days are hard for me. And I know it's hard for others. It's not just me. But on those hard days, are you reaching out to God? Are you seeking Him? Because if you're not, then you're missing the whole boat. You're not seeking safety. You're not seeking shelter. Because you're not going to the life giver. You're not going to the one who's going to throw out that life jacket to bring you in out of the storm. And so we want to offer up that opportunity. If there's something that we can do for you, if you need the prayers of the congregation or you need to obey the gospel, we are here to help you. So if you'll come forward as we stand and sing 111.